Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm going to be looking at Daft Punk soundtrack to the film Tron Legacy. Film soundtracks are kinda weird. They're usually presented in the same fashion as an ordinary album, but they're not really judged in the same way. Listening to a film soundtrack is a very different experience from listening to a traditional album. Generally speaking, film soundtracks reuse melodies a lot, and consists of lots of really short tracks. If not done right, this can lead to a highly repetitive and boring experience that serves little purpose outside of being accompaniment for the film. However, it's my philosophy that the best soundtracks can be enjoyed completely on their own terms. And there's few examples of film soundtracks that stand up so well out of context than Tron Legacy. While it does fall for the typical pitfalls that most film soundtracks are guilty of, such as having lots of really short tracks and reusing melodies a lot, it also succeeds in being quite memorable and giving individual songs their own identity. Another problem that film soundtracks typically fall for, especially when the artist isn't usually known for writing film soundtracks, is that the soundtrack doesn't sound like something that artist would usually come up with. Like, it clashes with their usual style. This is a bad thing, obviously, because why hire Daft Punk to do a soundtrack if you can hire Hans Zimmer to do the soundtrack and get pretty much the same results? But while Tron Legacy almost suffers from this problem, as much as the soundtrack features your typical string arrangements you could get from someone like Hans Zimmer or Danny Elfman, mainly the former, Daft Punk do manage to inflict their usual style on the soundtrack by adding in a menagerie of electronic sounds, leading to a good mix of both electronic and orchestral tracks, all adding to the dark science fiction setting. I always like some variety, and despite Tron Legacy's repetitive melodies, they keep just enough variety to give each song an actual individual identity. If a song doesn't have a unique melody, it has a unique feel or atmosphere, and vice versa. Most of the tracks fall into one of two categories. Category 1, big epic tracks with a lot of punctuated strings and big, booming, glitchy percussion for like big action scenes and stuff. And Category 2, typical Hans Zimmer style string arrangements. Category 1 features songs like Recognizer, Arena, The Grid, Rinzler, Fall, and of course The Game Has Changed. All these songs sound really similar, but they all have different melodies, so they all work on their own merits. At least, except for The Grid and Recognizer, which use the same melody. The Grid is special in that it has that Jeff Bridges dialogue at the beginning, but otherwise I think the darker sounding Recognizer was the more enjoyable track. The Game Has Changed is probably the best out of all these tracks, as it's the longest and the most fleshed out. Category 2 is just all our straight orchestral arrangements, and despite the fact that these tracks are much more Hans Zimmer sounding than Daft Punk sounding, honestly I like all these too. Some are like really epic, like Outlands, Clue, Rectifier, while some are more subtle and slow, like Nocturne and Finale. These two were my least favorites for a while, admittedly, but I've actually come around on them a lot. Finale is probably the better one of the two, as again, it's longer and more interesting. But I've also found the tune and atmosphere behind Nocturne has grown on me a surprising amount. There are more, but most of them are not much to talk about. Overture, Arrival, and Flynn Lives all have the same melody. Same melody from The Grid and Recognizer. Out of those three, Flynn Lives is probably the best, given its slightly faster pace. And Overture has the excuse of being the first song and the tone setter for the soundtrack/album, but Arrival is probably the least special, and as a result the worst. It's not bad, it does have like a cool triumphant fanfare sound to it, but other than that, it really does not stand out at all. So, on the opposite end of string arrangements that don't stand out, that leaves several tracks that either fit into both categories, or don't really fit into either category I mentioned, and stand out because of that. Disc Wars and Adagio for Tron could fall into both categories. Discourse combines elements of both in that it's mostly a string-driven song, but it also has some more electronic-ish percussion and a pretty cool synth melody in the second half. Adagio for Tron is similar in that it starts out as a straight string composition, but in the second half brings in more electronic sounds, although this one's a lot more subtle, like songs like Nocturne. Both very interesting tracks though, but my favorites on this album are the ones that don't really seem to fit in either category, and mostly have Daft Punk screwing around with their electronic sounds. The Son of Flynn has all these ascending synth melodies that almost kind of remind me of Jean-Michel Jarre. Armory has a very subtle and mysterious feel to it, starting out with all these dark, bassy, shifty synths, adding like a little shakerish percussion, and then later some strings as well. Very cool track. End of Line is a straight electro track, starting with these weird, unsettling synths and 808-ish beats, and then this big synth bass melody. And later we get all these cool, glitchy sound effects. Awesome song. Derezzed is the closest we get to a traditional Daft Punk song, involving like a repetitive and catchy synth melody and a big overblown beat with some stutter edits halfway in. This was the only single and most people's favorite track, and I kinda wish it were longer, but it's definitely one of the most memorable songs off of here. Solar Sailor has a very peaceful and melancholy atmosphere to it, starting out mostly electronic, but later bringing in a string melody as well. This was definitely one of my favorite tracks, and I remember being really disappointed to hear the song didn't appear in the movie until the credits. Speaking of the credits, the last song I have to talk about is Tron Legacy End Titles. This song may feature exactly the same melody from Grid and like, 4 other songs here, but it's put together like a dubstep song, making it really sound more like Daft Punk. It would have made for the perfect ending to the album, although Finale did the job pretty well, all things considered. So, overall, this was an excellent soundtrack, obviously, and one of the most easily enjoyable without the help of the movie. Sure, watching the movie helps, and I would recommend watching it. The story can be kinda confusing and hard to follow, but my god, the visuals were impressive. And obviously, the soundtrack was a perfect fit for the movie. It really was kind of a style over substance movie for me, but, definitely worth checking out. But more importantly, the soundtrack works on its own merits and is one of my favorite efforts from Daft Punk in general. It sounds enough like Daft Punk to fit in with the rest of their discography, but it's different enough to stand out as its own memorable entry in their discography. As far as film soundtracks go, this is considered one of the best there is, and for good reason. I'd say that Daft Punk should do soundtracks more often, but I have a feeling that if they did another, they'd either devalue this one, or come up short to this one, and either way it'd make this a less special experience. But it's still a very enjoyable and memorable experience anyway, and I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. Overall, feeling an 8.3 out of 10. Favorite tracks: The Son of Flynn, Recognizer, Armory, Rinzler, The Game Has Changed, Adagio for Tron, Nocturne, End of Line, Derezzed, Solar Sailor, Disc Wars, Tron Legacy End Titles, and Finale. There's a lot of good ones. Least favorite track: Arrival. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to agree or disagree with me. But I'd also like to hear your opinion in the comment section. Or if you have any requests for what I should review in the future, make sure to tell me about that. Although, hopefully Random Access Memories should be the next thing I review. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.